Okay, I want to start this video off by telling you a little bit about myself and where I'm coming from. Not because I like to talk about myself, but just so that I'm not so easily misconstrued. The first thing that I want you to know is that I'm not your friend, and I'm not here to fight for you. But I'm not your enemy either. I'm not here to support you or help you, the viewer. I'm not here to agree with you, the viewer. And I'm certainly not here to pander to you, or flatter you, or tell you what you want to hear. My interest is only to promote what I call the truth, and what some of you might call the red pill. I also don't like labels, and I have no attachment to this MRA label. Feminist is also just a label, and feminism itself is just a word which means different things to different people. And I will make it clear what I mean when I use the word feminism, which I use interchangeably with radical feminism. My position with respect to labels has always been the same. I say, as long as you pay close attention to my ideas, then you can label my perspective however you want to label my perspective. I'll take no issue with that. If you think that my perspective is a feminist perspective, then you can go ahead and just consider me to be a feminist. Most MRAs are ex-feminists anyways, and they typically do have a lot in common with feminists. There's nothing wrong with having a lot in common with feminists. I very often do identify myself with the label of MRA, but only for a general audience, and only because I think that that label does an adequate job of summarizing my personal views most of the time. But I don't really care if you call me a feminist, an MRA, an egalitarian, or an anti-feminist, just as long as you don't misrepresent my views and my intentions. And for those of you who want to know more about my views, I provided a selection of links in the description box for you to explore at your convenience. The way I see it, I'm not here to defend men and boys. I'm really only here to defend the truth as I see it, and my perspective has largely been shaped by my academic background in psychology, philosophy, and economics, particularly by the theory of evolution by natural selection, the philosophy of science, philosophy of mind, the psychology of emotions, microeconomics, and game theory. The first thing that I want to do in this video is jump right in and address what I see as the central arguments of Barbarossaa's 2.5-hour long video response. I liked his video, and I gave it a thumbs up because I think that it advances the discussion forward. Next, I will address responses from both Razorblade Candy and that Cynicism. And then I will go through and address a few of the points that Barbarossaaaa made in his long video response, one by one. First, a little bit more about me. I've always been primarily interested in digging and investigating in order to find the truth. But I'm only somewhat interested in the truth about why the truth was buried in the first place. I usually just take it for granted that the truth would be buried. I'm convinced that feminism is not true, and that's what makes me arguably an anti-feminist. But I honestly have no hatred or ill will towards feminists as people. I do sympathize with them, I do talk to them, I do get along well with them. I don't mind disagreeing with them, and I don't mind agreeing with them either, whether they happen to be male or female. And as I've already said, labels are irrelevant. It's the ideas that really matter. I am much less sure, though, about what brings feminism about and what sustains it. Although this is sure to be very complex, and there are many speculative ideas out there which I'm willing to entertain. I do know that the main vehicle through which feminism is propagated is through the public education system and through academia. Although it's also propagated through the mass media as well. Feminism does appear to be very well established, and its influence is exerted from the top down, not from the bottom up. The way I see it, we are immersed in a radical disorientation that some people call the blue pill world. And in what follows, I'm going to offer part of an explanation for how this blue pill world is maintained. What is it about this modern, technologically advanced society that is so disorienting, and why is it that way? When we speak non-feminist heresy, we are speaking truth to power. But what is the nature of the power that we are upsetting? You say that it's women, Barbarossaaaa. You say it's women who are being upset. What I have done here is an attempt to formally express the two main arguments that are central to your response video. These two arguments are very similar, but somewhat different. And before I address them, I want you to inspect them very carefully to make sure that I'm not misrepresenting your arguments in any significant way. So to restate your point, if a dominant paradigm doesn't have truth on its side, then it must have some equal or greater force on its side. And if Gynocentrism is this force that is actively suppressing the truth, and if this force is generated by evolved biological predispositions, then those naive dysfunctional MRAs don't really know what they're up against and won't be able to overcome it. Trying to defeat the feminist perspective without changing the culture first is just like throwing ice cubes at the sun. Premise 3 of this argument is very weak, and its weakness is amplified and carried over into subconclusion 4 and into conclusions 7 and 8. The first point that I want to make here is that the established perspective is not necessarily the most valid perspective available. To err is human. I've done a much more in-depth investigation into what feminism is and what sustains it in other videos, and you can find the links to those in the description box. The truth is, though, feminism does have a lot of answers, and feminism actually does do a pretty good job of answering many of the questions that people have about how the world works. It all seems very plausible and convincing to many people. The problem is, it's just not true. Feminism is much more like a religion than a scientific theory, though, and the fact that it's not being recognized as a religion also gives it a huge advantage over other religions, because those religions have all been somewhat tamed and contained by their recognition as religion. It is also useful to talk about the origins of feminism and its core beliefs, not in order to point fingers or to blame anybody, but simply to explain what feminism is, how feminism works, and how feminism obtains credibility. Because people often ask, well, if X isn't true, then why have I always been told that it is? And why do the experts and authorities all tell me differently? Truth does tend to erode those structures that are built on bad ideas over the long run. Argument and inquiry, logic, the Socratic method, evidence, and the scientific method all aid the victory of truth. Sometimes religions and ideologies collapse quickly, and sometimes they die out slowly. These outcomes are not easy to predict. But it is still a fairly safe bet that the truth will prevail over the long run, much like how gravity always seems to win over the long run, but not in any absolute or universal sense. My own personal view is that radical feminism, which most people just call feminism, is more like a house of cards than the Great Pyramid of Giza. Feminism really has not stood the test of time. I think that it is also important to keep in mind that hindsight is always 20/20, and to resist the power of hindsight bias, which can easily lead one to conclude that feminism was somehow inevitable or predictable, even though it might not be. And I would also add that even though feminist ideas might seem particularly ludicrous or stupid to some of us, they are still probably nowhere near the pinnacle of human stupidity. The main crux of my argument here, though, is that when you speak of gynocentrism as being like a force, you equivocate between the sufficient cause and the necessary cause of a phenomenon. Being a necessary cause does not imply that something is a sufficient cause. For example, just because you have to get behind the wheel in order to get into a car accident does not mean that a car accident is the inevitable result of getting behind the wheel. Getting behind the wheel is an important factor which obviously contributes to car accidents, but it's not the only factor, and therefore it's not a sufficient cause of car accidents, because it's possible to drive a car without getting into a car accident. So here are a few potential candidates for necessary causes of feminism. Technology is one, gynocentrism is another, and the gender conflict model is another. A quick word about gynocentrism. Even though I've never been a fan of this MGTOW version of the concept of gynocentrism, because it's so nebulous, even though I myself have used the word gynocentrism to mean something very different, something which follows the etymological tradition of words like ethnocentrism and androcentrism, I'm going to use the term gynocentrism in this video in a way that follows this new MGTOW tradition, but in a relatively narrow manner. For the purpose of this video, I'll use gynocentrism to mean the set of all evolved biological predispositions, which together create a social environment that promotes women's safety, comfort, and health at the expense of men's safety, comfort, and health, but only when there is a perceived conflict between the sexes. Now, in order to explain what feminism is and how technology and gynocentrism contribute to it, I'm going to need to cover some basic conceptual ground with respect to the two basic games that determine all of the needs and wants that human beings have. Those are the survival game and the mating game. I will start with the mating game. The mating game has to do with reproductive fitness and sexual selection, and in Western society, it is primarily concerned with obtaining the best possible mate. We implicitly understand the rules of the mating game, but it is often taboo to openly talk about it, at least outside of the manosphere. The mating game is embedded relatively high up on the Maslow hierarchy of needs, and it is a pure competition, because in the mating game, females compete with other females for mates, and males compete with other males for mates. This competition stems from the principle of substitution, because one potential mate serves as a substitute for another potential mate. And this explains why good catches will tend to end up with good catches, and rejects will tend to end up with other rejects. A high status mate is a kind of social good, and social goods are always scarce. On a large scale, we can never have any more or less social goods, because all that they can do for you is move you up or down on the social ladder, which is fixed. Every time someone moves up, someone else moves down. There is therefore no possible way that everyone can actually achieve high status, because status is relative. Men are much more open about the competitive nature of this game as compared to with women. And it's very easy to understand the mating game if you apply microeconomic principles to evolutionary psychology, and it's also very easy to see how this game underpins and explains just about everything that we do. It explains why we find value in status, beauty, romantic love, power, pride, respect, inclusion, exclusion, ambition, humiliation, dignity, esteem, vanity. You get the idea. Individuals within each sex are competing for these social resources, but there is no competition between the sexes for social resources at the collective level, since women do not actually compete with men for mates and vice versa. There is therefore no reason to be jealous of the opposite sex, and no reason to view the opposite sex as the competition, or as a rival, or as the enemy of the other. When it comes to social resources or success in the mating game, even though individuals from one sex may sometimes interfere with the ambitions of individuals from the opposite sex, at the collective level there is no rivalry, competition, or conflict between the sexes when it comes to the mating game. With technology, the mating game becomes an escalating arms race within each sex, and because things like time, money, and effort can be used to acquire both physical and social resources, more and more of our time, effort, and money is now being spent on securing for ourselves a bit more of those fixed social resources that are available. The only possible way to put the brakes on the mating game would be to adopt universal androgyny and some combination of pansexuality and asexuality. The survival game, on the other hand, is much more cooperative and lower down on the Maslow hierarchy of needs. Human beings depend on cooperation for survival. Again, in this game, the sexes are generally relying on the survival of each other for reproduction, so as to guarantee their own survival. To survive, you need food, water, shelter, security, medicine, things like that. In this game, male and female are mutually dependent and complementary, to the extent that in some situations, individual women become more vulnerable and more valuable for survival than individual men. This survival game manifests itself as gynocentric social patterns, which can later become obsolete. But regardless, the collective interests of both males and females are bound up with the fate of our immortal genes, and so that which truly benefits females at large will also benefit males at large, and vice versa. You can easily separate mortal male bodies and minds from female mortal bodies and minds, but yet you cannot separate the common survival interest of the sexes, which is encoded right into the immortal DNA that we both share. So how might technology be a necessary cause of feminism? When we speak of feminism as being a product of technology, or as being caused by technology, we are actually conflating two radically different forms of causation and blurring an important distinction. Western civilization is technologically advanced, and you could make a convincing case that technology is partly responsible for feminism. Perhaps technology promotes feminism because it renders the survival game irrelevant and obsolete, and therefore moves us into a radically different and socially competitive environment. But it doesn't change our primal instincts. For most of us, water, food, shelter, clothes, and the basic necessities of life will all still be available to us, no matter how badly we screw up. But if you do end up at rock bottom, this means that you won't be able to pick or choose who you associate with, and you will be looked down on. So really, we are no longer playing the survival game. Instead, we're playing another game, and confusing that game with the survival game. This is a very important part of the blue pill world of disorientation that we find ourselves in. In this new world, where the mating game is the only game that we play, we don't even realize that the survival game is actually a thing of the past. In failing to realize that, we begin to treat the mating game as if it were actually the survival game. We begin to treat the social resources as though they were actually concrete physical resources, like food and water and shelter. Having moved up that Maslow hierarchy of needs, most feminist issues are focused on obtaining more and more of these social resources for women, but because they are social resources, this is a goal which can never ever be satisfied or achieved. As a consequence of this general shift in priorities and goals, Gynocentrism now starts to creep into the distribution of social resources as well. Whereas it used to only apply to physical resources, and only for survival purposes, and only under truly desperate and dire conditions. Feminists claim to want more status, more beauty, more power, and more dignity for women. And it is very easy to see why individual women would want these things for themselves. However, it's very difficult to understand why individual women would want to give these resources to their direct competitors, namely other women. Women cannot possibly obtain social resources on a large scale due to the nature of social resources. All that can be done is to give some women higher status at the expense of some other women. It's just like shuffling people around in a lineup under the pretense of helping everyone to move ahead in the lineup. But efforts to do this can still be justified because people don't look at the big picture. Some people appear to think that men and women are actually competing for the same social resources, and they just don't see social resources for what they are. They think of them as physical resources. People in general also start to feel as though their lives are completely dominated by this mating game, and they sometimes begin to resent the opposite sex for this fact. They might blame the opposite sex for the fact that they feel so much pressure to wear makeup, or to go to the gym, or to do whatever they think will make them more attractive and desirable and help them to do better in the mating game. We also become so highly competitive in this post-survival game world that we can more easily imagine a competition where none actually exists. It becomes much easier to imagine that we are competing with the opposite sex, of all people, and for social resources, of all things, because everything seems to be a competition. And all of this clears a path for the feminist perspective, but it doesn't guarantee the establishment of feminism. It might be necessary, but it's not necessarily sufficient. In order for feminism to really take hold, people also need to accept one very simple and very important idea that lies right at the heart of feminist thought. That idea is the gender conflict model. This is your generic collective conflict model, and it's being applied to the sexes. Male versus female. This is the ideological basis of feminism, and the main root of feminism, if you will. We humans are accustomed to using collective conflict models because there are so many situations which are deeply important to us where this model could be correctly applied. For example, two rival tribes, rival ethnic groups, or rival nations go to war. The winner wins, survival for now. The loser receives death, rape, or enslavement. This is a collective conflict that we are deeply familiar with. The struggle for survival, the war of good versus evil. We also tend to view the other side as, quote, the enemy, but not our side. This is the basis of racism, ethnocentrism, and many other isms. But war is not the only correct application of the collective conflict model. There are other examples as well. Two families or clans may struggle for socioeconomic status within a society. Rich versus poor, elites versus masses, royalty versus peasants. Winning in this context means that you have status, beauty, and power, which confers reproductive and survival value. Being on the losing team actually does mean that you lose social resources in such a case. These are the two main examples where the collective conflict model can be correctly applied, and there are also situations that are intermediary, and there are many other examples of this like rival gangs, rival religions, rival ideologies, rival corporations, rival sports teams, and the list goes on and on and on. The important thing is that you have an us versus them, that we share a common interest or a collective interest, and that they share a common interest or a collective interest, and that our collective interests are opposed to their collective interests. If we lose, they win. If we win, they lose. If we benefit, they suffer, and vice versa. Our strength is their weakness, and vice versa. What is so revolutionary about the feminist perspective is that it is the direct application of the collective conflict model to the sexes, which then results in the gender conflict model. So how does gynocentrism promote feminism? Through directing social as opposed to survival resources from men to women, gynocentrism partners up with the gender conflict model, which is what makes the interests of the sexes appear to be opposed. The collective conflict model opens up new opportunities for gynocentrism to expand its relevance. The collective conflict model therefore acts as a catalyst for gynocentrism. If it were not for gynocentrism, then we might end up with, say, masculism instead. Gynocentrism is a way of explaining why people tend to side with women when they think that men and women are on opposing sides of a conflict. Feminists also use this gynocentrism in order to protect their ideology from criticism by identifying their ideology with the interests of women and by conflating criticism of feminism with criticism of women, and by conflating antagonism towards feminism with a danger or a threat to women. Without a combination of the collective conflict model being applied to the sexes, gynocentrism, and technology, feminism could not be so well established and entrenched. So long as the sexes are viewed as being in conflict, the female side will always have more support than the male side. Hence, feminism will dominate as long as it is viewed as being on women's side. This is why feminism, through promoting the idea that the sexes are in conflict, and through focusing on real or imaginary conflicts between men and women, has been able to persist in spite of its intellectual bankruptcy, because it encourages people to join this imaginary struggle, and it attempts to frame all disagreement as support for the enemy. But I think that this process works somewhat differently for women and for men. For gullible women, their indoctrination into feminist ideology begins with the universal struggle of me versus the world, which we can all relate to. But then, as they ally themselves with other women in similar situations, it is quickly translated to the nonsensical struggle of women versus the world. And then with more indoctrination, this morphs into women versus the patriarchy. And then eventually it settles into women versus men. Part of this is women defending what they falsely believe is their own self-interest. And part of it is women's desire to conform and be accepted by other women. For men, on the other hand, they have different reasons for taking women's side when they see a conflict. Men are warriors, and as warriors, we're capable of seeing other men as the enemy, but we are much less capable of seeing women as the enemy. So it's not hard for us to choose a side in such an imaginary conflict. And it is true, after all, that women are not the enemy. In truth, there is no gender war. There is only gender mercenaries and gender demagogues who profit from the belief that a gender war exists. To a true believer in feminism, universal rules of conduct cannot possibly be applied to the sexes, because the only thing that's relevant is how a situation fits into a larger gender conflict. If a particular woman is violent, controlling, and aggressive towards a man, then she's empowering women and fighting the good fight, and that's good. But if a man is violent, controlling, and aggressive towards a woman, then that empowers men, the enemy, and that's bad. That's the feminist lens in a nutshell. Feminism works by framing the issues and putting them into a larger context, in a larger moral, political, and theoretical framework. The power of feminism is more in the framing and explaining of issues than in the spread of misinformation. And even though the feminist perspective often defies common sense, it often works with common sense as well. For example, do you know how many calories are in a glass of water? 0, you say? But how do you know? Did you need to be explicitly told that? Did you consult a nutrition expert? Or did you just figure that out on your own with common sense? Common people rely on common sense, so they will give highly predictable answers to the following questions. Who is stronger? Who is more violent? Who is more aggressive? Who has more testosterone? Who is less vulnerable? Who is more likely to be a criminal? Who is more physically dangerous? Who is more likely to win in a fight? If you answered men to all of those questions, then congratulations, you have common sense. Is common sense wrong? No, of course it's not. But it can be misleading when an issue like domestic violence is framed in a misleading way. If you allow a feminist to frame the issue, they'll always ask, who is the real victim here, men or women? On the one hand, if you prime people to question this abuser-victim model of domestic violence, and you give them the facts, then they will see that this question is totally irrelevant. The idea that domestic violence is male on female primes people to think about it in terms of abuser and victim. And the abuser and victim model also primes people to think about domestic violence as male on female. These are mutually reinforcing mental models, and the feminist propaganda is always designed to reinforce both of these models. Feminism frames the issues that it examines as a conflict between men and women, and thus it forces you to take a side. I will have a little bit more to say about the feminist perspective later, but before I do that, I want to address your second argument. This second central argument actually depends on a false dichotomy, which is set up by an equivocation with the word women. This argument, as formalized here, is actually a few separate arguments combined. So I need to break this into two separate arguments in order to show you how it's a false dichotomy and how these two choices can both be interpreted as true statements. With respect to the first argument, We still have some ambiguity here because it's not clear what we mean by women, and therefore it's not clear what we mean by women are responsible for their own behavior. Are we talking about women as individuals, or are we talking about women as a group? If I interpret this as meaning women as individuals, then it says that each woman is responsible for her own behavior, but it doesn't say that she's responsible for the behavior of other women. If I interpret this as meaning women as a group, then it says that women each share responsibility for each other's behavior. Unfortunately, we are so much better at understanding individual behavior as opposed to group behavior, so we do have a human tendency to personify groups, just as we sometimes personify animals or natural phenomena like lightning. It's an inherent bias that many of us share as we try to grasp something that's unfamiliar. The notion of responsibility, guilt, and blame works really well with individuals, but once we try to apply it to groups, particularly when we're talking about very large groups or very disorganized groups, like women, it just falls apart. Therefore, this argument is only cogent and valid if we interpret women here to refer to women as individuals. Secondly, who is actually brainwashed? Is it some women, most women, or women as a group? What if, say, exactly 5% of women are completely brainwashed by feminism? I would say that the reality is that some women are fully brainwashed by feminism, and some men are fully brainwashed by feminism, and that most women have at least been partially deceived by feminism, and that the majority of men have also been partially deceived by feminism. But regardless of how brainwashed a woman is, she is still absolutely responsible for her own immoral behavior, even if it is morally justified from her own perspective. So ultimately, this premise is false. Now for the second argument. On the one hand, it seems very likely that the overwhelming majority of the people who have designed feminism, promoted feminism, and bought into feminism have been women. And a true believer in feminism would naturally conclude that feminism does benefit women, although I've already made the case that it doesn't really benefit women collectively, due to the inherent competitive structure of the mating game and the permanent scarcity of social resources. And so it does not follow that feminism benefits women at the expense of men. However, it obviously can benefit some women at the expense of some men, and also at the expense of some women, and also to the benefit of some men, just as with shuffling people around in a lineup. Women are involved here, but it does not follow that they are culpable as a group. Guilt and revenge are useful concepts when applied to individuals, but it just doesn't work when you apply it to an entire gender. While it is false that women and feminism have nothing whatsoever to do with each other, and that's a straw man argument, by the way, it does not follow that each woman is responsible for the behavior of all other women, that feminism gives women as a group an advantage, or men as a group, that women as a group benefit from feminism, that feminists speak for women, or that feminism and women are interchangeable for all intents and purposes. And before I move on to the next section of my video, I want to address two other false dichotomies that I think are at play here. So how do you fight against a viral infection like Ebola? Do you study the virus and learn about its relevant strengths and vulnerabilities and try to exploit those vulnerabilities? Or should you study the host to learn about its relevant strengths and vulnerabilities and how the host can be better protected? What do you think? Which is the better option? That's a trick question. It's actually impossible to make a choice here because if you're engaging in one of these activities, then you're also necessarily engaging in the other. In this context, the strength of the host is also the weakness of the virus, and vice versa. Any analysis of one is also the analysis of the other. So in studying the behavior of the feminist ideology, we're also studying the behavior of its hosts, and in studying the behavior of its hosts, we're also studying the behavior of the ideology. There is no need to choose between the two. And here's another false dichotomy that I think is at play here. Why is it that most feminists are women, and who is really pulling the strings? Is it true that women are more manipulative than men? Or are women more easy to manipulate than men? I would say that women are both more manipulative and also more easy to manipulate than men. Women are more social, more conformist, more empathic, more fearful, and more emotionally dramatic, and this makes them both more manipulative and also easier to manipulate. Now on to Razorblade Candy's initial response to me. Oh, that reminds me. One thing that really bothered me about your video, Barbarossaaaa, was when you compared yourself to Razorblade Candy. Razorblade Candy should never be compared to Barbarossaaaa, because Razorblade Candy deserves 8 billion subscribers, and he's infinitely smarter than Barbarossaaaa. And the fact that you agreed with Razorblade Candy about my understanding of the Nawalt acronym is just infuriating, because I know that you have absolutely nothing in common with him, and I think that you're just trying to imitate him. That's why you both accuse me of hypocrisy, isn't it? Razorblade Candy said in his video that Nawalt is just a response to people saying not all women are like that, even when it's totally irrelevant. Barbarossaaaa said pretty much the same thing in his video response when he raised the issue at the 15-minute mark, and at the 28-minute mark, and at the 33-minute mark. Let me start at the beginning. It doesn't really matter to me what Nawalt is supposed to mean, or what it originally meant once upon a time. I was talking about how the Nawalt acronym is actually being used by MGTOWs, what it has come to mean, and how it fits in with and supports the MGTOW identity and lifestyle. Barbarossaaaa said that I don't have any evidence to support my claims. Well, I do. These are comments left by MGTOWs on my channel, and you can see for yourself what Nawalt means to them. These comments are not in any way responding to cheap deflections of a perfectly valid generalization. The context in which the Nawalt argument is being used here is not in any way whatsoever a response to a fallacious argument. Apparently, the Nawalt argument has evolved into a noun. Specifically, a Nawalt is actually a kind of woman. It's a mythical woman who is not like that. And of course, that can mean pretty much anything that you want it to mean. It just means a woman who you would feel alright about trusting. A woman whose postulated existence might cause you to break your commitment to the MGTOW lifestyle. The Nawalt is the harmless woman. And the Nawalt acronym is used to endorse the strategic presumption that the harmless woman does not exist. It's just a safe presumption. It's the precautionary principle. It's Schrodinger's rapist. A woman can pretend to be Nawalt, but do not be fooled. Eventually, you will discover that she's not really a Nawalt. Nawalt really has nothing to do with defending the objective analysis of general trends, or looking at differences between the sexes, or any kind of scientific investigation, as Barbarossaaaa claims. As you can see, Nawalt is a device which keeps men isolated from women and prevents them from trusting women. That's all there is to it, just as I had already said in my previous video. I really think that the two of you should know better, and I'm surprised that neither of you have taken notice on how the Nawalt acronym is actually being used proactively by men going their own way. Also, at 33 minutes into his video, Barbarossaaaa says, Stone reveals his Gynocentrism. And how do I do this? Barbarossaaaa says that I did this by claiming, without evidence, that the Nawalt acronym was developed because MGTOW secretly believe that some women aren't like that. Nope, I never said that. I never said or implied that MGTOW secretly believe anything. What I said was that the Nawalt acronym is used to bolster the assumption that all women are like that. Whether that assumption is genuinely believed, or whether that assumption is just being used as a precautionary assumption. The point is to prevent men from considering marriage, and to prevent them from allowing themselves to be vulnerable with respect to women. And lastly, since you have both accused me of hypocrisy, and because Barbarossaaaa has stated that I have a religious fear of generalizing about women, which he also said was evidence of gynocentrism and evidence of my gynocentric mind. And that's very telling because it shows you how powerful Barbarossaa's own confirmation bias is. Gynocentrism is everywhere. As a matter of fact, I have no problem with generalizations, and I never implied in my video that I think that generalization is wrong. I did say that MGTOW have to generalize about women, and I still think so, and that's because they need to have some reason to rule out the possibility of entering into marriage. But they are not generalizing for the purpose of drawing sensible conclusions, and that's my point. That idea that MGTOWs feel strongly obligated to generalize was just a premise in my overall argument. I was not implying that it's wrong in and of itself to make generalizations. I was not implicitly evaluating whether or not it's okay to generalize, because it really just depends on why you're doing it and how you go about it. There are valid reasons for why MRAs would avoid making generalizations about women, though. When we make an incorrect generalization, this damages our credibility. And unlike MGTOWs, credibility is valuable to MRAs. It does not help us if we look foolish, ignorant, or biased. Also, when we make irrelevant generalizations about women, we get sidetracked and derailed from an otherwise fruitful discussion. When a somewhat eloquent ex-feminist woman delivers the shocking truth to a receptive audience and a bunch of MGTOWs start to attack her credibility and her ethos based on the sole fact that she's a woman, and they start accusing her of only looking out for her own interests and only pretending to care about men, as if her true motivations really make a difference. That's clearly not productive. This happened in response to my video, The Fempire Eats Its Own Worker, after it was posted on A Voice for Men, and I was more than a little shocked at the reactions to it. There's a link to that video in the description box. The thing is, MRAs generalize all the time when we're trying to explain some phenomenon, like the wage gap, for example. We really don't have any fear of generalizations. And I sure don't. Now, why don't I consider razorblade candy to be a radical? At 34 minutes into your video, Barbarossaaaa, you say that I used razorblade candy, and I quote, to differentiate between, quote, radical and non-radical MGTOW, end quote. The sad thing is, you just quoted me, but the words that you put into my mouth, under quotations, are words that I've never said. I never ever used the word radical in reference to MGTOW, and I never divided MGTOW into two groups. This is just how your mind re-envisioned what I was saying. I don't use terms like radical, hardcore, extreme, or fringe interchangeably, or in a flippant manner. One thing that I did say was that you and Stardust should not be dismissed as being, quote, fringe or extreme. I actually said that the two of you are just about as mainstream as you could possibly get. Radical does not mean extreme anyways, it just means that you're tackling the root of a problem. Radical feminism is just the name that so happened to stick to true believers in patriarchy theory because they saw themselves as attempting to really uproot male power and male privilege. And I definitely do not think that being a so-called moderate is a good thing, and I do not consider myself to be either a moderate or an extremist. And quite frankly, I think that moderates and extremists are two sides of the same coin. Check out my video on this topic that I have linked in the description box if you want to see a more in-depth analysis on this topic. And back to Razorblade Candy specifically, who has said in a previous video of his, I don't recall exactly which one, but it was something to the effect of that the men's movement should be organized around opposition to gynocentrism instead of feminism, because otherwise the men's movement could not be forward-thinking and progressive and would merely be reduced to a reactionary backlash movement. I disagree strongly with that conclusion, and Cootie's video on subverting feminism, which I've linked in the description box, explains my disagreement concisely. Now onto That Cynical Cynicism. That Cynical Cynicism asks, do you have a better hypothesis? His hypothesis is that industrialization and better living standards are actually what led to the rise of the feminist movement. Barbarossaaaa has also made a similar claim in his video, saying that technology was necessary for feminism, and he actually challenged me to find examples where feminism flourishes in the absence of modern technology. And as you've seen, I've just given my own hypothesis at the beginning of this video. I agree that improved living standards have probably been a necessary condition for feminism, but I don't think that it's a sufficient condition for feminism. I think that feminism also depends crucially on the gender conflict model, and by feminism I'm referring to the religion of feminism, not to any set of broader cultural changes like women working outside of the home, or playing sports more, or shifts in gender roles or things like that. If I were to talk about feminism as representing a set of cultural norms, then that would really cloud the issue. That cynical cynicism also says that we can generalize about which sex has it worse off on the whole, and he asks, would you concede that there are many legal disadvantages that men face which women do not? Well, in one sense I agree, but in another sense I disagree, actually. Because I really think that comparing men's lives to women's lives is a lot like comparing apples to oranges. To talk about advantages and disadvantages implies that you have a goal, a self-interest, that you are trying to win. And as I've explained near the beginning of the video, when it comes to the only games that actually matter, the games that are responsible for all of our wants and needs, all of our preferences, our pleasure and our pain, those games being the survival game and the mating game, and we're only really playing the mating game at this point, men are not actually competing with women. A man's only competition is other men, and a woman's only competition is other women. However, having said that, I do oppose bias and discrimination because of the inherent problems with hypocrisy. Hypocrisy really shows a lack of standards and a lack of principles. I think that consistency is a valuable thing in and of itself. And I also think that giving people the benefit of the doubt and the presumption of innocence is a really important principle for both men and women. And when there's a bias, this just tells you that there's a problem with accurate decision making. And of course, both feminism and gynocentrism can interfere with that decision making. I also don't think that men have a worse life in general. At the 13-minute mark of Barbarossaa's response video, Barbarossaaaa makes a very similar claim. He mentioned men being the majority of the homeless, the suicide victims, the military deaths, the victims of violent crime, the prison population, and believe it or not, these are the standard MRA talking points. And I've repeated these talking points many times while arguing with feminists and ordinary people. My point in raising awareness about these facts is not to imply or to try to make the case that men have it worse, in some general sense, than women do. My point is only to challenge the prevailing feminist notion that women are oppressed, because that's entirely based on cherry-picked facts and half-truths. The prevailing notion is that women have it worse because they are less likely to obtain a prestigious position in politics and in business, or because they get paid less, or because they were denied the vote, or because they were once presumed to be stupid, inferior, incompetent, weak, etc. Basically, the argument is based on cherry-picked facts to make it look like women are oppressed, because most people agree that African Americans and other ethnic minorities are oppressed and disadvantaged, and the argument is that society treats women just like black people, in terms of the barriers that keep them out of the most prestigious and desirable circumstances. And the best way to interfere with that one-sided analogy is to also add the list of the ways that men are also treated just like African Americans, in terms of how they will more often end up in the least desirable social circumstances. Here's a link to a video called Response to You Had Me at Hayek, where I go into more detail on this, in case you have any further questions about this argument. I also think that you can't know what it's really like to be a member of either sex unless you've actually been both, but I go into much more philosophical depth on this subject in a video entitled I Don't Know What It's Really Like to Be Me, and the link is in the description box. I can say, though, that men receive more tough love, while women receive more coddling and enabling. Men are much more overconfident and they tend to have a much higher tolerance for risk. Men tend to be more rebellious and individualistic. Men are typically more creative. Men are typically less empathic. And as a group, men are much more variable, diverse, and extreme. To compare the two really is just like comparing apples to oranges. And on an even deeper level, to say that one sex has it worse is to me just as silly as saying that 6-year-olds have it worse than 35-year-olds. I mean, 6-year-olds are treated differently than 35-year-olds, after all, and you could easily come up with all kinds of reasons to support your conclusion that 6-year-olds have it worse. But if you wanted to, you could also come up with all kinds of reasons for why 35-year-olds have it worse. Neither of these arbitrary lists would prove anything, because you're not even comparing different groups of people. You're only comparing different stages in life, which can only meaningfully be considered together as parts of a whole life. You cannot separate the interests of 6-year-olds from those of 35-year-olds. Sure, at any given point of time, it might seem as though some of us are 6-year-olds and some of us are 35-year-olds, but over the course of our entire lives, anything that affects 6-year-olds also affects all of us, and anything that affects 35-year-olds also affects all of us. In order to see where your interests lie, you need to take a step back and look at the big picture. And you need to remember that life is short. As males, we're only half of our species, half of our tribe, half of our children, whether your children end up as male or female, half of our family, and we're only half of our future and our legacy. We are only part of a greater whole. You are guaranteed to die someday, but your legacy might not die. If you're living in a world of instant gratification and hedonism, and you're not thinking about your future or your legacy, then you're still living in a blue pill world. It's important to develop an accurate sense of what's good for you and what's lethal over the long run, and to transcend your impulses and your instincts and your immediate experiences of pleasure and pain in order to see how you're being manipulated and misled. The red pill can be good for you because it can help you to see the future consequences of your current trajectory. It's an illusion that men exist independently of women, just because we have our own separate male brain, our own separate male mind, and our own separate male body. But if you take a step back, you'll see that we're really only half of a larger whole. So who has it better, my right hand or my left hand? Who really has the upper hand? Now I want to address the rest of Barbarossaa's video. At around the 9-minute mark, Barbarossa claims that I said that MGTOWs cannot have a satisfying sex life. And he also claims that I said that a satisfying sex life is somehow traditional. Of course, Barbarossa goes off on a tangent and says all these claims are false, and he claims that marriage actually decreases the frequency and variety of sex. Well, that's all well and good, but what I actually said was that MGTOW involves giving up on fantasy, key word here being fantasy, of a happy, stable marriage with 2.5 kids, a dog, a white picket fence, a satisfying sex life, and just about everything else that is considered to be traditional. So, if you were paying attention, it really should be obvious that I was listing things that exist in the realm of imagination. I did not say or imply that marriage actually gives men a satisfying sex life. And I did not imply that MGTOWs can't have a satisfying sex life. What I actually said, more or less, was that as long as men cling to this idealized, romanticized vision of marriage, then not only are they setting themselves up for disappointment, but they're also going to resist going their own way. In other words, the red pill is actually painful and hard to swallow for most men. This is really not a controversial or contentious claim, but yet, it was an important premise in my overall argument, which was that men need motivation to go their own way. And when I added that becoming MGTOW means giving up on almost everything that's considered to be traditional, that really does not imply that I consider a satisfying sex life to be traditional. But that's how you chose to interpret what I said. Next, at around the 11-minute mark, you speculate that I might be confusing MGTOWs with MRAs. Why? Because you say that MGTOWs don't wish to influence, persuade, or negotiate with women. Rather, the purpose of MGTOW is to have open discussions amongst men as free as possible from the corrupting influence of women. This is an interesting angle. I'm not opposed to the creation of male-only spaces in principle. But when you said that I am confusing MGTOWs with MRAs, you implied that MRAs are trying to negotiate with women. That's false. You have no basis for believing that MRAs are trying to negotiate with women. MRAs are just trying to spread the truth to as many people as possible. And we're also trying to empower people to speak the truth to power. But yet, MRAs do in fact choose to work with women. So how can I say that MRAs aren't trying to persuade or negotiate with women? Well, because there's a big difference between influencing or negotiating with women as a group, as opposed to influencing or negotiating with women on an individual level. I don't think that you appreciate that distinction. You're just blurring the two together as if they're the same thing. It's one thing to work with, negotiate with, or persuade a woman, and it's another thing to persuade or influence women as a group. You're equivocating here between women as separate individuals and women as a group. MRAs do work with women as individuals, but they don't work with women as a collective. And your main criticism of the men's rights movement is that it's not free from the influence of women, which does sound very much like the words of a paranoid conspiracy theorist who treats women as moles and infiltrators. As a logical consequence of your position, you're now parting ways with all of those MGTOWs who support the idea of a marriage strike. Men are not walking off the job, you might say, but they're actually walking off the plantation. And you say that this scares women. But why do you insist on believing that this actually scares women? It shouldn't scare women. I don't think it works that way. Just as a price is subject to negotiation on an individual level, prices are also subject to the forces of supply and demand on the collective level, which only resembles negotiation. Predictably, suppliers prefer the highest price possible, and buyers prefer the lowest price possible. But the overall price depends on where the two meet on aggregate. If either a buyer or seller feels like they're getting a raw deal, either of them can just walk away from the deal. Some men will walk away from a woman because he's generally not interested in her. And other men will walk away from a woman hoping that she'll chase after him. There's no need for us to speculate about his hidden motivation because the result is the same in either case. If millions of men do decide to walk away from women, then women will react predictably, by chasing after men and acting a little bit more desperately. We know this to be true. This is true regardless of the reasons for why any particular man would choose to walk away from women. There's clearly power in going your own way, regardless of the reasons behind it. So no, I don't confuse MGTOW with MRAs, I don't see anything wrong with working with women, and I have nothing against the existence of male-only spaces. Also, just because I say that something is true doesn't mean that I think that MGTOWs don't agree with it. It's just a premise within an overall argument. The actual point in my original video was simply to say that the MGTOW struggle is both against the inner animal and also against the outer society and culture. And I think that my point was completely lost on you, Barbarossaaaa. When I said that it's better to acknowledge and work with our inner beast than to work against it or to deny its existence, that was not to imply that MGTOWs would necessarily disagree with that. At the 22-minute mark, you say that, the same as the feminist meme, is false equivalency and guilt by association ad hominem, and you accuse me of doing this. You say that your use of the notion of Gynocentrism is different from how feminists use patriarchy theory, and you also say that women use force to implement and act on patriarchy theory, but that MGTOWs don't use any force. This is irrelevant, because this has no bearing on the validity of the idea itself. My argument is only that your notion of gynocentrism as a source of explanation is just as flawed and confused as patriarchy theory, which doesn't make it just as harmful, but so what? It's just as false and confused. Do you really think that you can rescue it by claiming that, well, at least it's harmless? In fact, I think that your implicit endorsement of the gender conflict model actually supports both feminism and gynocentrism. So frankly, I do think it's harmful. Shockingly, at around the 23-minute mark, you actually said without any hint of irony that the same as the feminist smear is the same kind of tactic that the feminists use in order to shut down a debate. And you don't seem to appreciate the hypocrisy in that statement. I mean, you just did the very thing that you said that you're against. And you also accused me of being the same as the feminists several times throughout your video. That's very bizarre. My intention was never to promote guilt by association or to shut down debate. There's no such thing as a perfect analogy, but drawing parallels and analogies as you've done yourself can be a very effective tool to make your point succinctly. And when I say that you're using this notion of gynocentrism in much the same way that feminists use the notion of patriarchy, I do this because it's true. Because the truth is, the concept of gynocentrism has caused you to stop thinking. You've concluded that gynocentrism is the root source of all sorts of problems, and you really do seem to see evidence of gynocentrism everywhere. And it seems to serve as a crutch that you use to feel like you actually understand how the world works. At around the 50-minute mark, you say that gynocentrism is not pseudoscience and that it's not unfalsifiable because you can find evidence to support it. Well, Barbarossaaaa, it is abundantly clear from that statement that you made that you don't know what the word unfalsifiable means. I recommend that you read Karl Popper's seminal essay, Science is Falsification. It'll only take about 5 or 10 minutes for you to read, and I think that you should read it because falsifiability is an extremely important concept to get a handle on. Falsifiability is really what separates science from pseudoscience. And falsifiability cannot possibly be established by finding facts or evidence to confirm or support your theory, since the assumption is that confirming evidence is cheap and easy to find from nearly any pseudoscientific and unfalsifiable theory. A falsifiable theory, on the other hand, is a theory that is actually exposed to the risk of falsification and can therefore be tested. Falsifiability is bondage. Falsifiability ties together prediction with explanation, and it also ties together risk with reward. If you refuse to expose your theory to the risk of refutation, then it can never be tested and should never be granted credibility or validity. Hindsight is always 20/20. These extremely vague, all-explanatory theories are worse than useless. They can only tell you what you already know, and for everything else that you don't know, they'll just lie to you about it. I concluded a long time ago that feminism was unfalsifiable and pseudoscientific. That's the main reason that it's difficult to convince feminists to change their point of view, because they seem to be convinced that they owe so much of their understanding of the world to feminism, and it seems to them as though everything that they learn about the world always confirms their previous understanding, no matter what the facts are. They always seem to fit somehow, and I'm going to describe feminism in a bit more detail in just a few moments. You also claimed, Barbarossaaaa, several times in your video, that women fear men, that women don't care about the well-being of men, that women support sexist policies that discriminate against men, and that women use force to enforce misandric policies. This is your conflation between women and feminism that both feminists and MGTOWs such as yourself are so often guilty of. When it suits you, you conveniently forget that feminism is not women, that feminism is not even feminists, it's just an ideology, and it's a lot like a religion. It's a religion that has been built by both men and women, and it suits both men and women. The only problem with this ideology is that it's misleading nonsense. You're calling this idea corny or a lie, and saying that you have heard this before, or that it's boring, or that it's getting old, or making sound effects like wow wow wow. None of these are actually valid arguments. There's no point in blaming men or women or feminists or feminism for anything. The point is not to lay blame. The point is to expose harmful and misleading misconceptions. But you really need to know what I'm talking about when I say feminism. so please allow me to define feminism for you. Feminism is a belief system that's based around the idea that gender is analogous to class, and that there exists a gender conflict and a gender hierarchy, just as there exists a class conflict and a class hierarchy under the Marxist belief system. Feminists call that hierarchy patriarchy, and they believe that women are oppressed under patriarchy and that men are powerful and privileged. They also believe that gender socialization is a product of patriarchy, and that patriarchy is a product of gender socialization. So in other words, according to feminism, patriarchy trains women to be servile with respect to men, and trains men to dominate women, and the prevalence of these servile women and dominant men also perpetuates the patriarchal system. But in addition to that, they also believe that the whole system of patriarchy and gender roles is actually reinforced and maintained by male violence against women, whether it's domestic violence, murder, rape, sexual harassment, or just little insensitive comments or microaggressions like spreading your legs too much on the subway. And a lot of men and women have been indoctrinated into viewing society in that way. Hence, when feminists set out to dismantle the patriarchy, they will do obvious things like trying to put more females into leadership positions, trying to decrease the overall amount of male violence and aggression against women, encouraging female violence against men, trying to free both men and women from their prescribed gender roles, deconstructing masculinity and femininity, and promoting androgyny, gender bending, and homosexuality because they think that patriarchy could not exist without gender roles. Since you cannot have a hierarchical system based on gender if there's no way to clearly identify and discriminate between the genders. So that's feminism in a nutshell. And the only problem with feminism is that it's wrong. That's it. I wouldn't have any problem with feminism if I didn't think that it was an inaccurate description of society. I've also made a few videos on this subject, and you'll find links in the description box. At the 24-minute mark, you say that I want the responsibility for the mess that we're in to be shouldered by men, but not by women. Okay, Barbarossaaaa, where are you getting this nonsense from? You're wrong. I'm not playing the blame game. At 30 minutes into your video, you explain why you think that female MRAs attract more subscribers than you think they deserve, and you claim that this is caused by obsessive gynocentrism within the MRM. Of course it's gynocentrism's fault. Everything is gynocentrism's fault. I do think that you're onto something here, but I don't think that it's gynocentrism. MRAs are trying to speak truth to power, and they're trying to spread both awareness and meta-awareness, which is the awareness that other people are also aware. Women are sometimes a better vehicle for delivering the truth to the masses than men are in this context, because women have slightly more credibility when they voice opinions that contradict feminism in a world that's dominated by feminism. Oh no, but that can't be the reason. It must be gynocentrism. Or we'll just call it gynocentrism so that it sounds like we have just confirmed our theory of how the world works. The MRM is not dysfunctional. When female MRAs get a lot of views, and they thereby get their message out to the masses, that's what I would call functional. They're getting the job done. That is the work that actually needs to be done. And we should not allow petty jealousy and rivalries to interfere with that important work. At the 58-minute mark, you say that the MRM has had 3 or 4 decades to progress, but yet it's had no progress at all. Well, your measurements and your expectations are completely arbitrary. Have you been paying attention to how quickly the MRM has been growing recently? This is just about the most ridiculous time to express pessimism. 10 years ago, I might have understood the pessimism, but why now? There are going to be plenty of risks and challenges ahead, no doubt, but it's not comparable to throwing ice cubes at the sun. And I don't understand where all your pessimism is coming from, but I know that it's not based on an honest assessment of reality. I personally think that the internet and social media was the real game changer of the past 40 years when it comes to the men's movement, just because it showed us that we're not alone. And that's the most important message for our movement. At the 1 hour and 6 minute mark of your video, you say that biology plays a factor in voting and in politics, and you say that I'm arguing that it doesn't. Of course biology plays a role in voting and politics. Okay, next. You say that the "how can she slap" video and the woman abusing a man in the park are both examples of gynocentrism. Actually, I think that the woman abusing the man in the park is really more of an example of feminism, because the woman is clearly cheering on the woman, much like a sports fan would cheer on their own team. She thinks that the abusive woman is empowering women and fighting on her behalf, and on behalf of all women. That's a very feminist idea. And I don't think that the mob of white knights were actually being protective or showing any genuine concern about the well-being of the woman in the "how can she slap" video. They just saw an opportunity to kick a man when he's down, and they rose to the occasion. Mobs are like that. The "how can she slap" guy was just a convenient punching bag. Gynocentrism is a lazy answer. It doesn't really explain what's happening, or how. At the 1 hour and 13 minute mark you say, Stone is afraid to talk about gynocentrism. That's another baseless projection. I've been using the term gynocentrism with a different meaning ever since I derived the term myself over 7 years ago. I'm not afraid to use the word, and I've done so several times over the years, but I just don't like unfalsifiable, all-explanatory theories because they suck. And as for the evidence of hypergamy and female hypoagency, and some of the other things that I listed in my original video, I just want to make it clear that in my original video I was not claiming that these ideas are incorrect. In fact, I think that these are valid concepts, but that there's no need to obsess over them, because what I see is that they're being used specifically in order to promote gynophobia and misogyny, in order to promote an us versus them mentality, and also to promote the mistrust of women. That's what I see as the problem. It's the us versus them gender conflict model that I see as the problem. You also said in your video that I cherry-picked an old clip of you saying that women are the enemies of men. Well, if you've changed your opinions since then good for you. But unfortunately, you decide to leave that open to doubt. Anyhow, I think that it should be clear by now that I have valid reasons for opposing the gender conflict model. The gender conflict model really just fans the flames of what you call gynocentrism, and it truly does cause dysfunction. So are we clear now? Do you have any questions? Please feel free to comment, like, subscribe, etc. See you later, folks.